Well, hi everyone. This is Pedro Garcia. I am founder of Ask and Wonder. This is a show that brings Christians and non-Christian thinkers to talk about the biggest questions in life. And I'm extremely excited to have an incredible biologist and secular thinker with us today. His name is Bryan Gitschlag. How are you, Bryan, today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited because we're going to be talking about the topic, what does science tell us about reality? And before we get into the conversation, I would like to say that, we have a YouTube channel now, and I assume that you're watching it right now. And the name, of course, is Ask and Wonder. And also wanted to say something about the podcast. The podcast is back. And these interviews are going to be presented to you in a podcast version as well. And if you guys are interested and just want to be part of the conversation, you want to say something to me about the show or potential thinkers you would like me to interview, any thoughts you might have about this, please, you can email me at askandwondernashville@gmail.com. And you'll see also a link in the description of the video about all of this. I'm excited to start a conversation with Bryan. Bryan is an incredible thinker. He's a very humble person. He's incredibly intelligent, and I'm excited for him to talk about this and tell us more about all of this. So Bryan, I would like to start the conversation with you and ask you a little bit about you and who you are, what you do. Will you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. So currently I am at Vanderbilt trying to complete my PhD in biology. So I'm just finishing up my 6th year. So this summer I will have been working on my PhD for 6 years, which is a little. It's going to be a little above average, but also with what's been going on currently, lab activities, research is kind of in a holding pattern. So it'll probably be several more months before I can actually finish writing my dissertation and wrap that up. I can't remember if you mentioned this already, but I used to be a Christian, and I no longer am. I don't know if you want me to talk about that now, or if you have specific questions to follow up on that.
Yeah, definitely. You can go there. I was going to ask you about that, Bryan. Will you tell us about that transition, please?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, well, I pretty much grew up in the church. From middle school, high school time frame, I was very active in the youth group, and I was very interested in science because at the time I was very enthusiastic about trying to use science in an apologetic context, right? Like to try to use science to basically defend the faith or use it as a tool for evangelism.
Yeah.
And that was actually my goal for a long time. I used to read a lot of books by creationist thinkers and intelligent design advocates. I became very interested in evolution long before, during this period of time, even when I didn't think that it was real. So a lot of that kind of thinking actually fed into my decision to go to school and to what it is that I wanted to study when I got to school. So I was in the Army after high school for about 5 years. And when I made the decision to go back to college, I ended up enrolling at a Christian university so that I could try and study science and the Bible kind of side by side, because it was my understanding that studying both of them in a kind of a side-by-side context would give me more of a richer understanding of the world and the worldview that I held at the time. I managed to make it through college with a bachelor's degree in biochemistry, and I still had my faith intact. When I got to graduate school, it was in the first couple of years that I started not only studying, I had already been studying science and I continued to do so, but I also started to study more philosophy and pay more attention to the nature of the conversation between believers and between mostly theists and skeptics or atheists, so to speak. And it wasn't really science per se. Like, it wasn't evolution, for example, or the Big Bang Theory that led me to walk away from the faith. It was more the participation in the conversations between believers and non-believers, or I don't really like using that language, between theists and skeptics, I'll say, or between theists and atheists. And so the transition kind of happened slowly. I couldn't really pin it down to any one tipping point. It was just kind of over time, the more I listened to and gave careful consideration to the arguments from Christians and from other faith traditions, and then hearing the counter arguments or the rebuttals from skeptics. And, you know, the more time I wrestled with this conversation, I kind of gradually over time saw that my confidence that the supernatural exists, and I don't want to specify that it's necessarily just the Christian faith or just the existence of God that I'm talking about. Just in general, the idea of the supernatural is something that my confidence that it exists kind of gradually waned over time. And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so you would say, Bryan, that it was philosophical argumentation or dialectic what actually moved you away from the faith more than just discovering patterns of through the scientific method?
For sure, yeah. I don't think it's yeah, no, it wouldn't be accurate to say that science led me to be an atheist. No, there are great scientists that are still Christians, and, you know, I don't have a problem with that. You know, people tend to leave, or at least should tend to leave, their metaphysical worldview at the door when they go to do science, you know, because the you know, the mass of the electron isn't, you know, influenced by whether you believe in Jesus or Allah or, you know, Lord Shiva, or whether you're an atheist altogether.
That is very interesting. So let me ask you a question, Bryan. In terms of philosophical argumentation, what arguments would actually, no, sorry, make you rethink and scrutinize the Christian faith to the point of saying, you know, perhaps these arguments are not good enough for me to be a Christian?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of them was the historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, I could elaborate on that if you want, but I mean,
yeah, would you do, of course, if possible, Bryan, like an overview? So that was one, and because I would like to focus more today on, if you don't mind, on science, but that is interesting that was one of them.
Yeah. So there's the what's sometimes known as the anthropic principle, or, you know, in a broader category, it's sometimes referred to as the fine-tuning argument. You know, and it's this idea that is very popular among Christian apologists, that the conditions of the universe, things like, you know, the force of gravity, you know, the mass of the subatomic particles, the expansion rate of the early universe, you know, there's this idea that all of these conditions in our universe have to fall within a very narrow range in order for life to be possible, or in order for life as we know it to be possible. So that's sometimes called the fine-tuning argument, and is used as a justification for believing that there is a God or a creator. There's also the cosmological argument, which is the idea that there is a conscious mind, or, you know, a supernatural creator that is, you know, asserted as being the best argument or the best explanation for where the universe comes from.
That is very interesting. So I would love to perhaps another day to explore some of those arguments with you. That is very interesting. So when it comes to then, when you started studying science and delving into it and just recognizing patterns and the language of mathematics and, you know, the scientific method and all of this, and I'll go directly then to the question. When you're studying, when you go to the laboratory, when you're recognizing that there are patterns that are intelligible, and you're seeing things that work and we can understand, as a scientist, what does all that data, and I don't know, data is a plural, but I don't know if I should say do in English. You correct my English if you have to.
No, you're fine.
Okay, what does that data tell you? I don't want to push you to
Hmm.
say anything about God at all. I really want to tell you from an honest perspective as a human
Hmm.
being that is discovering the world at a level that not many of us can as a scientist, where you're dissecting reality at the level that you do. What does that say to you about the nature of reality?
Oh, I actually love this question because I actually think about it quite a lot.
Okay.
Um, so one of the things I'm really interested in is trying to build a a bridge between my understanding of life at a fundamental, or excuse me, my understanding of reality as we know it or as we experience it at a fundamental level in terms of the laws of chemistry and physics, trying to build a bridge from that over to how it is that we understand, or what it is that gives rise to the more complex nature of life we see around us, things like
Mm,
culture and social behavior.
mm,
And so evolutionary biology is a great way to kind of dissect that, because it sort of bridges, or it sort of spans the spectrum from molecular biology and biochemistry all the way over to culture and social behavior. And
mm.
it's actually just to give you one quick example, the there's a field of mathematics, applied mathematics, called game theory.
Mhm.
Excuse me, you might be familiar with. And
Would you explain it to me and to the audience, especially for me?
yeah, so basically, it's a set of well, it's a field of study, but it's a set of um, theorems and equations that are used to try to model complex behaviors where you assume that the individuals involved are rational actors.
Mm,
And so this is used in economics, and in fact, it was mostly developed initially as a subdiscipline within economics to try to explain, decision making, for example, in
mm,
marketplaces.
mm.
And it was the evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith, and there were a couple of others, but I think he gets most of the credit for it, for taking the concepts and principles of game theory and applying it to biological systems.
Hmm.
And so now you might have heard of the well, there's a number of specific examples. There's something called Nash equilibrium, which is um, it's basically a status or a state where it's in nobody's best interest um, to deviate from the pro-social or the group-oriented behavior.
Mm, mm,
And there's another concept in game theory, or there's a game in game theory called the prisoner's dilemma, which has to do with whether or not two prisoners are going to basically rat each other out, if assuming they have information on the other.
I see. Yeah.
And
Mhm.
there's concepts uh, of game theory like Nash equilibrium and the prisoner's dilemma, and there's others as well that are actually used in microbiology literature, because these principles and these equations that apply to the study of economics and human culture and social behavior also apply in some contexts equally well to
Hmm.
the adaptive behaviors that we see even in systems that don't have brains, like bacterial cells interacting with each other.
So, would it be fair for me to say that what you're focusing not now at this moment, what science tells you, or what you discover by following the scientific method and describing nature as you see it, is to how to understand our human conduct and the way everything is socialized or interacts, and how everything is interdependent and something like that.
That is a big part of it. Um, I I don't want to I don't want to exaggerate the
Yeah.
degree of importance of what I'm doing, but that is, at the end of the day, that is a personal goal that I have, of just
Hmm.
trying to understand, trying to reach as good and comprehensive of an understanding of the world as I can, with however many years I have left.
Mm.
And part of that is um, applying what I know and what I understand from things like wildlife or the study of biological systems, and
Mm.
seeing where those principles and where those patterns repeat themselves from, the space of microbiology to animals to, human society, for example. Um, one of
And
the yeah,
Brian,
sorry.
so let me ask you another question about this. So, do you ever take this conversation to the point this conversation that you have with yourself about the nature of things, and all these conversations, you take it to the point of saying, be, beyond interdependency, why is it that there is something there? I know that this is the ultimate question for a philosopher, or maybe this is outdated, but I think it still is. Why is there something rather than nothing? And the ideas as to how the universe can be intelligible for us and we can understand this, and the nature of not actually when we describe things, we know that they're there, we describe them, but we're actually discovering them. They're things are working already. We're just maybe building mechanisms in order to understand them through patterns of I don't know, a mathematical equation and all this. But when I want to go with this conversation is, do you actually wonder why there could be something there, and there's this in the reasoning that you find for that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a question um, that I think about a lot. The kind of the, why is there something rather than nothing question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I mean, I don't pretend to have, the ultimate, capital T truth answer to it, but the, the best I could, as far as, hazarding a guess, the best I could say is that because there can be, I don't think, my favorite answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing is because there can be, or that there, isn't some rule that says, there has to be an explanation or an answer for why there's something, otherwise there would just be nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's this principle in physics and chemistry, well, the quantum mechanics, basically,
Yeah.
which kind of, sort of overlaps a little between physics and chemistry. It's mostly physics, but there's a subfield of chemistry, quantum chemistry. And there's this concept called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle,
Mm.
which basically has to do with it basically describes that the uncertainty with respect to, in this specific case, the position and momentum of a subatomic particle. And it basically, tells you that there's always some degree of uncertainty. You can never know 100%, when or where a subatomic particle will be and how it'll be moving with perfect accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you extrapolate that out to a larger scale, you can make the case that that there's always going to be some degree of uncertainty. In other words, if you wait long enough, sooner or later, there could be a particle there where there wasn't one before.
That is very interesting. If you don't mind, Brian, I would like to share with you what happened to me. And of course, no scientist, I'm no philosopher. I'm just love having conversations about this. And I like, of course, learning about this. But something that is puzzling for me, and that is one of the big reasons why I actually became a theist,
Mm-hmm.
um, is because when I was an atheist and I was trying to find explanations for things, usually explanations end up having terms and words that describe all the things to explain that explanation. So uh, if I ask you, why is there something rather than nothing? You answer, because there can be. So it seems that for you, it's because there's a possibility. And when I was an atheist, I was thinking, so the explanation for this is that there is a possibility, and that I'm not taking the conversation right now to the point of this can be or cannot be.
Mm-hmm.
My mind always went to the facts of there being something else that is explaining this. So
Mm-hmm.
using more terms to explain something else. So when it comes to explaining the nature of things or the nature of reality, why reality is and or is not,
Mm-hmm.
one of my problems was just using more terms and more things to explain things that already exist. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why it took me to a point of saying, it is not that I want to force this in me, but makes sense for me. It made sense at the moment to think that there should be, or there could be, sorry, I'll use could, there could be an explanation that goes beyond this pattern of things, or things that can be described, that
Mhm.
at least is just beyond of this pattern of, let's say, cause and effect, or just using terms inside of the system to explain things that are already inside of the system. And that is something that kind of pushed me not to believe in the God of Christianity, which I actually do now. But it took me from saying, okay, I should be perhaps more open to the possibility of something that is supernatural. I am very aware of the connotations and the implications of in today's world. When you say supernatural, the
Mhm.
connotation is incredible, incredibly charged, and I would like to just approach to this term as neutrally as possible, just saying there's something outside of the system that made the system be what it is today. Do you have any thoughts or something that you could add to this, or you may challenge me with?
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite clear on where the justification comes from for thinking there has to be something outside of nature, though. Like, what, I guess it would help to know, what do you mean by supernatural, or how do you define that?
Yeah. So uh, very interesting, because when it comes now, I would say there has to be, and I'll be fair with you. When I was an atheist, I was asking myself questions about this. My reasoning was there could be something, and I know that it's sometimes not fair to extrapolate for example, the way I experience the world. It's just I'm a human being in the middle of this expansive universe we know almost nothing about. And the fact that I have a mind and I use my mind in order to build relationships between causes and effects. And when I see something, I expect that there's something outside that caused this. I know that this extrapolating my experience to the expansion and the explanation of the whole universe. I get the sense that it might not be fair. But for me, when it comes to the point of, as of now, what we know about the universe, I know it's not much. Perhaps it's a lot, or you can help me more with this. But there's nothing as special and complicated to understand as our brain at this moment. And the fact that nature and through a process of evolution that I actually believe is true, everything about this, uh, the fact that nature decided to create, I'm sorry for the question, or just to come up or to bring forth an entity that is able to think about its own existence and understand the world around it, and using terms in evolution. And of course you can correct me and help me with this, but terms like random, or natural selection, or randomness in terms of mutation, when we're using those terms in terms of evolution, we usually don't use those terms when we talk about science. It's very interesting that we actually got to use terms like randomness when it comes to evolution, because
Mm.
we don't like that term when it comes to science. That brought me to think about this perspective. There is something like a brain that is a given, and there is nature that is another given. And here we are as human beings, recognizing patterns and discovering things that they are there already. We're not creating anything. We're just discovering something that is there with a tool that is a given. We cannot even control this tool that it has been given to us. When I see this incredible system that works so beautifully, um, it pushes me to think that I don't know, in terms of a universe that could be chaotic, and from a universe that could be intelligible, the way we use our minds to understand the world. I don't think that is a silly argument, or is irrational to think that there could be something else And not only something else, I'll push the conversation for my perspective, not something else, but something else that is that is rational, that actually put everything in motion. I would make that step forward. I'm not talking about Jesus at this moment. I'm not talking about,
Mhm.
I'm just talking about type of deism, because that was kind of the way I transitioned. Deism for me and for everyone, it's just believing that there is a mind that created everything, but it's not interacting with it, with that thing or the universe that it created. So I think that in terms of cause and effects too, Bryan, um, I think it's very rational for me to think that there could be something that sets everything into motion. I understand that in terms of science, at the level that we understand reality now, we see cause and effects in reality, but we actually could go to a level of quantum physics if we understand that our understanding of cause and effects could actually vary there. But there's still a problem there. There's something there to understand. And if, for example, at the level of quantum physics, we cannot, and let's imagine that we get to a point of understanding that cause and effects cannot be understood the way we understand it at that level. There's something more puzzling for me, which is from this level emerges a reality that can be understood by beings like us. It's
Mhm.
just that it gets to a point, the conversation, where applying the reasoning of finding a very easy hypothesis to put everything together and make sense of everything. I would say that thinking that there is something beyond all of this, and that's that with being a thing that is rational, is actually just to be redundant. It's a rational thought. What do you think about all this?
That's a lot.
I know, I'm
Um,
sorry.
no, you're fine. Uh, so I think, so you mentioned there had to be something that um, put the motion in place for, for the universe that we live in.
Yeah.
Um, I guess that the thing that I would push back against on that is that I I think that itself kind of has some underlying assumptions that I wouldn't share or that I would caution against.
Hmm.
It's kind of natural, or it's sort of part of our everyday intuition that, if you want to um, if you want to see something move, then you have to push on it. You have to apply some sort of a force to it. I'm one to make this comparison or this analogy. The physicist Sean Carroll kind of sort of alerted me to this idea that uh, there's this principle in physics, the conservation of momentum.
Hmm.
There's Newton's laws of motion. you know Based on the last few hundred years of the gradual accumulation of our understanding of how the universe works, we've kind of been pulled away from that reality that we used to understand it as, that that there has to be some underlying reason why something is moving, to this reality based on having more information about the way the universe works, that things just move. That is their natural state. And if you want something to move, all you have to do is leave it alone. It'll continue moving.
Hmm.
And that it's actually, it's only until something encounters resistance, like, it hits a wall or it encounters friction, that it'll actually stop moving. And so I think that the idea that, in order, if you apply this to the universe itself, the idea that something had to push it or had to get it going, in order for us to be here today talking, is, I think, relying on an assumption that um, doesn't always hold true for every part of the universe. It may not hold true for the universe itself.
Hmm.
There's a bunch of different models for why or and how the universe came to be what it is now. I'm not an expert in cosmology or astrophysics, but my understanding from listening to experts and listening to talks and reading on the subject is that there's a variety of different options on the table for why the universe could exist or why it has the properties that it has.
Hmm.
And some of these are, there's bouncing cosmology models, there's inflationary cosmology models. The inflationary multiverse is my favorite personally, because it's the one I'm the most familiar with, and it's the one that, as far as I can tell, is the most widely accepted among physicists who study the early universe, and it seems to have some evidence going for it in its favor. And it doesn't make the assumption that there has to be a conscious entity. I mean, so, some of the arguments you make, I could, or some of, at least, some of the points you raise, I could at least get on board with on some level, but then I would have to stop you when you reach the point where you say that there's a conscious mind or a conscious agent that's responsible for the early universe or for why the universe exists, because I could just as easily say, well, maybe the universe has some explanation for its existence, but that explanation is a physical mechanism. It's not a thinking mind, and that, from what I can tell, is less contrived, or it's a more parsimonious explanation. And I welcome your thoughts on that, I guess.
Oh, definitely. So, Brian, I like all that. The there could be an explanation about the universe that we see and we experience today that emerges plainly from a mechanism. I'm incredibly open for that because the scientific method is one of the most beautiful things that we humans have been able to come up with. The thing that puzzles me at sometimes is just the way we when we talk about science at this level, we're talking, of course, about science, and we need to remain scientific. That's why science is actually so good at what it does. Because I'm completely aware that when I go, this could actually lead to a conscious mind beyond the universe. I know that the vocabulary that I'm using is not scientific at that moment. I'm aware of that. But the thing about this, Brian, is very interesting to me. The way we experience life is when we have a set of data in our lives, whatever it is, we human beings, we make decisions according to that data and we live life according to it. Something that I fear with science at some points, and I'm not talking about this from the typical perspective of, okay, this is a Christian and seeing science as something that is going to undermine my worldview. I believe in the God of the good gaps. I believe in the God that actually makes a rational foundation to the things that we find, no matter what we find. So I'm not scared of anything that we could find. So I'm talking about from the perspective of, sometimes I get the sense that science does an incredible, we do as human beings in science, we do an incredible job when describing things, but once we have this data doesn't usually lead us to understanding all the facets of life, of reality. It's like saying, when it comes to philosophizing about how things are, what things could be, or what finding this singularity at the beginning of the universe, or what this could entail about existence itself, it seems that what we do is to describe what it is and push further to find another explanation, and push further to find another explanation. But with all this data, we're just describing stuff. But this is usually, I don't think that this is what we do as human beings. When we have data in front of us, we make decisions about that data, knowing that the nature of science is just to describe things as they are physically. But then as human beings, the way we experience life is not only that. There are several explanations that put together the way we experience the world. And I don't know if it's sometimes dangerous to only focus on, this is data, this is what we find, and there's nothing else beyond that. Because I fear also that it would get to a point where there won't be ever an explanation that would satisfy a scientist. Ever. And it doesn't matter if he's a secular or Christian or Hindu scientist. What do you think about this?
Sure. Um, I mean, I see what you're saying. Like, I don't want to give the impression that science and the practice of science should, control every aspect of our lives, right? Like I do science, I love science, but it's not like, um, there are things that I do with my life that I don't really, well, I was going to say that I couldn't, but maybe it's more that I just don't bother trying to dig in on the scientific reasoning behind it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I love art and music, and well, speaking of art, I actually painted that.
Oh, wow.
Um,
You're an artist as well?
a little bit,
That's
yeah.
amazing.
Um,
Wow.
but in any case, I there are levels of human experience that we don't experience through the practice of science. I completely agree with that.
Mm.
Uh, Science is what I would describe as just the process of finding out.
Mm-hmm.
We could have values, we could have passions, things we want to do with our time that have nothing to do with excuse me, that have nothing to do with doing an investigation or
Right.
finding something out. And the way to really know for sure whether you've found something out is to go and test it, right? Like if you have some mystery, something you just want to know the answer to, and you have some possible explanation, some possible answer that might be true, you know that's really only the starting point to science. That's not the scientific method, obviously. The scientific method is all invested in addressing the question of, if this is right, if this answer is true, then what, right? And the whole point of doing an experiment is that you're addressing that question, then what? If my answer is true, or if this explanation is the right one, then what is something else that I also expect to be true about the world? And you can make a prediction, and then you can go and do an experiment and test that prediction to see whether or not your answer or your explanation that you think is right, whether or not that's leading you accurately and reliably to new information. And so it's all just this process of finding things out. And so I would agree that finding things out is only one dimension of the way we live our lives, right? But it's an important one, and it's one for which we are currently limited. And when I say limited in this sense, I'm just saying we're limited because there are so many discoveries we haven't made yet. There's so many things we just don't know yet. And if
Mm-hmm.
only we did know, or only we could have that information, then it would improve our decision making and our thinking in so many other areas of our lives potentially.
Mm. So, Brian, for you at this moment, how far-fetched is it, the idea of the existence of God? For viewers and that are watching, you might be thinking, well, you're focusing on God. You could focus on so many things, but yeah, this is where my interest is. So yeah, that's where I would like to go with the conversation. So right now, um, in terms of actually natural revelation, let's put it that way, or some what we can induce from what we see in the world and what we can deduct from it. The fact that some people like me end up thinking that there's a God that is in control of everything, and we'll leave that in control of everything for another day, because that opens a very interesting conversation. How far-fetched is this idea for you at this moment? Is it to the point of incredibly irrational? Is it just, it could be, but I don't know. It is, what do you think?
I think it's pretty irrational.
Okay.
I I would put the existence of God in the same category as any other supernatural beings. Ghosts, um, goblins, genies. And I don't mean to be insulting with that.
I love that you're being so honest, and I hope that you even challenge me even more. Don't worry about that, Brian. We're having an honest conversation.
Okay, yeah, no problem. So some of the reasoning for that has to do with, well, not only the fact that, okay, so I shared a little bit of my kind of view on the world and attempting to connect what I understand about the physical sciences, right, to my understanding about culture and social behavior and
Mm.
other dimensions of higher order dimensions of human life. I think I misspoke a moment earlier. I just want to clarify real quick.
Okay.
When I mentioned things like Nash equilibrium and the prisoner's dilemma, those, even my descriptions of those were just kind of quick examples. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I that wasn't meant to be like an overview of like, this is how you connect the physical world to culture. Um, even, even saying that something like game theory is a model for cooperative behavior is kind of an oversimplification.
Mm.
I just want to clear that up. But getting back to what you said though, so part of what is part of what's adaptive and what's beneficial. You mentioned yourself that you accept the evidence for evolution. Um, Part of what is adaptive about humans is this phenomenon of cooperative behavior. And I've mentioned before earlier in this conversation, and even in previous conversations that you've hosted me for, that cooperation and pro-social or group-oriented behavior is a major component of our evolution. It's a component of our evolutionary history, reaching farther into the past than our own species, even further back into the past than animals.
Even at the microbiological level, right? You can.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, if you go to NCBI, you can search for the term social bacteria, and you're going to find research papers on this subject. There's a bacterial species, Myxococcus xanthus, I think is what it's called.
Okay.
Anyway, these are bacterial cells. They are actual bacteria, but they reproduce. They have the ability to reproduce as a collective unit, as a multicellular collective. And this process involves some of those bacterial cells basically sacrificing themselves so that other bacterial cells in the same colony can actually do the reproducing, so that they can actually go and establish the next generation. This phenomenon also exists in amoeba. There's a genus of amoeba called Dictyostelium, where these are single-celled organisms when there's enough food around. But if these organisms encounter starvation conditions, then these individual cells will group together, and then they can move around as a single multicellular body. And there's examples in yeast, baker's yeast and brewer's yeast, like the kind of yeast that's used, to make beer and wine. The species name is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. I guess that's probably not super important, but these are generally understood to be single-celled organisms, but under certain conditions. And there's a lot of research papers on this I could show you if you want to, build
Yeah,
a collection
definitely.
of
We
them.
can share whatever you want in the description of the video. We can talk about that later. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. There's a phenomenon called snowflake yeast, these are basically yeast that have been uh, subjected to conditions that select for multicellularity. So
Mm-hmm.
this is not the same thing as biologists going in and tinkering with the genome to try to genetically engineer these yeast to be multicellular. That's not what's happening. The yeast are being subjected to conditions that reward the behavior of multicellularity. In other words, they're just subjected to conditions where multicellularity, if that develops, like if the yeast cells are able to clump and form multicellular bodies, then that increases their chance of survival. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
number of examples where this has been shown in the literature. There's an example, for example, in the journal eLife, which is a popular peer-reviewed biology research journal. There was a paper a few years ago in eLife that showed that subjecting yeast to low sucrose or low nutrient concentration will select for multicellular aggregates, or select for the phenomenon of
Mm-hmm.
multicellularity. And you could extrapolate that to, and there's examples from animals as well, from social organisms like social spiders.
So what do you think that all of
Sorry, go
this
ahead.
would say about the question? Can you hear me, Brian?
My point was that I was trying. Yeah, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So where do you
Yeah,
think
sorry.
that all of this lead us?
Yeah, sorry. I think I might have got it a little sidetracked. I was trying to establish that the phenomenon of cooperative group-oriented behavior is really widespread. It goes far beyond humans. It even goes far beyond other social animals like beehives and honeybees and ants, I meant to say. Um, And one of the mechanisms that can give rise to this cooperative pro-social behavior, which of course has benefits for our survival, is the mimicking or the imitation of behaviors being one, as well as the well, I would say at least in the context of humans, it is the shared beliefs basically. When I say imitation of behaviors or mimicking behaviors, I probably being a little bit too narrow in the case of religion I was thinking of, but in a broader sense, there's a number of pro-social behaviors that are cooperative behaviors, and then there are more selfish behaviors and cheating, and selfishness and cooperation and cheating are things that and even the punishment of selfish behaviors are things that are not unique to humans. These exist in other species, and so I would say that the emergence of religious rituals being one example of a pro-social behavior that kind of helps bring a community together, and it helps promote social interaction and group-oriented cooperative behaviors. And I would say that shared beliefs, when multiple people within a community believe the same thing or believe something very similar, it makes it easier for people to come together as a community and to cooperate and to try to build something larger than themselves without a bunch of selfish infighting between the members. Like the Apostle Paul. I may not be a Christian, but I've read the Bible. There's a place in there's a couple of places in the New Testament where the message is very loud and clear that there shouldn't be division among you. I want to say it's in the first chapter of First Corinthians. I could be wrong on that. It could be in Galatians, but anyway, there's a place where Paul is writing to one of his churches, and he says, let there be no divisions among you. Let you be of one mind, and let there be no divisions among you. And that's that's a trend that holds true, not only across different human cultures, but even across different species. There's research, for example, in social insects, like in honeybees and in ants, where a selfish behavior is something that is punished by the rest of the hive or by other members of the hive. And the whole point of that, I shouldn't say the point of it, but the effect of that in terms of evolution and natural selection is that over time it gradually sculpts the gene pool to give rise to traits that are more pro-social and less selfish. More pro-social in the sense of being more oriented toward the good of the group rather than being more selfish and oriented toward the good of the individual members within the group. And so I would
Bryan,
say, go ahead.
So Bryan, if we actually discovered this set of behavior at the cellular level, for example, we can extrapolate it to the way we behave nowadays. What does this say about reality? Meaning, what we're seeing is that there's the existence of a mechanism that does something. That is which is incredible. It's a beautiful thing, but it truly. I mean, if, for example, we get to understand that every type of religious revelation could be explained in through a method through the scientific method in terms of materialism. The only thing that we would discover from my point of view is that there's a mechanism doing something, which actually could even undermine the facts that we're doing science today, maybe. So perhaps it's just like evolution, like nature wants to discover itself, because right now there are entities trying to understand each other or trying to understand the world. So for me, this is the reason why the fact that some people believe in God, I now don't find it irrational at all, because in your explanation, which I'm enjoying so much, what you're explaining to me, what you're presenting to me is that there is a mechanism that is doing something. And in terms of scientific terms, of course, I cannot explain at that level of the conversation. I cannot explain God at that level of explanation. But as we said, there is a whole spectrum of explanation that we take into account in the way we live our lives. And Yeah, I just see from what you're saying, I just see there's a mechanism doing something, and
Hmm.
the existence of a mechanism doesn't exclude an explanation, or, for example, an agent that actually puts it into motion. I might be pushing it too hard in terms of God, but of course I need to be respectful with your view, and also of course with mine, because I do believe that there is a God. So I don't know. I don't know if we actually, if through evolution, we actually explain every single pattern in human psychology. We could actually say that the human psychology could be undermined. That there's no, like, it's not important. You know, I don't know if it is actually rational to just stay with that data and not do anything with it. You know, you
Yeah,
think?
well, I wouldn't advocate to say once we have scientific data, we have, an answer to a question that we shouldn't do anything with it. I think
Mhm.
um, science should rightfully inform decision making, and it does already.
Yeah.
Whether you're consciously thinking about it or not. Like,
Mm.
there are aspects of the economy and the healthcare field, uh, you know sanitation, and if you open a restaurant, you have to submit your restaurant to health inspections, and there's aspects of space exploration and the environment and ecology. Like, we use science to inform so many other aspects of our lives already
Mm.
that that I that have had the effect of improving the quality of our lives in so many ways. Like, we wouldn't have the iPhone or the internet system that we're using right now to talk, that without uh, without scientific advancements.
Or a
But I
universe
guess
that
that's
actually
kind of
allows that, right?
was it?
Or a universe also, a given universe that is allowing for an iPhone to exist.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Um, so you made the point a moment ago about having, now correct me if I'm getting you
Yeah. Oh,
wrong here, if
please.
I'm misinterpreting you, but you made the point, I think, about how just because you have a mechanism that doesn't explain away the existence of an agent that made the mechanism possible.
Hmm.
Is that kind of along the lines of what you said?
Definitely could be an agent. I think it's an agent, but in
Mhm.
terms of the conversation, like the existence of a mechanism doesn't exclude an explanation that put this mechanism into motion. This mechanism at this level of the conversation could be an impersonal
Mhm.
mechanism, another mechanism, which would push the answer, sorry, the question further, and or it could be, you know, an agent that put it into motion out of let's say free volition.
Sure. So um, there was a debate a few years ago between the biologist Richard Dawkins and the Christian apologist and mathematician John Lennox
Yeah.
at I think it was at the University of Oxford,
Hmm.
where you know John Lennox made the point that having a mechanism doesn't remove the need for agency, or explaining the mechanism doesn't explain away the existence of an agent. And Richard Dawkins' response was that it does if the agent is superfluous to the role of the mechanism. And while that doesn't, that's not sufficient to disprove the existence of a god, it does, I think, kind of make it, I mean, it kind of encapsulates any kind of a point that I think could be put on this, in the sense that I I could agree with you that uh, having a mechanism may or may not have an agent associated with it, right? Like, if I go and do something, like if I start, if I go put the key in the ignition of my car and turn the car on, there's a mechanism that explains why the turning of the key leads to the activation of the engine. And that doesn't necessarily explain away, why the key was there in the first place. But then again, the agent in that particular case is a physical thing. I'm a physical person made out of atoms. And, if you chase it all the way back to the Big Bang, and then you say, well, the universe as we know it has a whole bunch of mechanisms, one after another. And there's agents involved, but all the examples of agents that we can point to are physical agents, right?
Yeah.
There's animals and there's bacteria and there's humans. There's no, I guess it's the logical leap that I don't see any justification for is to go from there's physical examples of agents to here's a non-physical agent that we should also believe exists. Like there's some logical leap that I don't see the justification
That
for.
is interesting that you're mentioning this, Brian, because and this is not usually the way it happens, of course, but the fact that you used an example of a car, for example, this is
Mhm,
actually the reason why I think some people come to the conclusion that the universe was created. Because in any life experience, if you use any situation in life in terms of mechanisms like a car, we know
mhm,
that that was created by a mind.
mhm,
So we just know it in situational philosophy when
mhm,
we do stuff related to our lives and we use situations like that, we know that the context of that situation is there's a mind that created that, you know. So
mhm,
extrapolating, you would say, oh, but extrapolating all of this to the universe, that is kind of a huge jump. And my question has always been, Brian, is it? Because we actually find also, you guys as scientists, you guys are finding the same thing that we find when we go to a car, a mechanism that works. That is exactly what we're finding when we actually go out there and we start analyzing the world. We just see patterns that can be understood as of now. I'm open to for more beings to do this in the universe. The
mhm,
only ones that can understand this are people with minds, the same minds that are capable of creating things, you know.
mhm. Sure. I would say that kind of reasoning or that example of
Mm-hmm.
reasoning that says in our experience when we see this type of thing happen it is contingent on a mind. I think that kind of reasoning could be flipped around because when you see an example of a mind, or at least every example that we have any evidence for, or any example that we can point to and say here's an example of a mind, it's always contingent itself on some physical hardware like a brain, or um, if you want to define a mind loosely enough to include
Mm-hmm.
artificial intelligence, we would say physical hardware like a brain or a computer. And so there's a ton of evidence that the phenomenon of consciousness, as at least as we understand it,
Mm-hmm.
um, is itself dependent on the function of our brains. And there's examples like, for example, consciousness itself is something that can be turned on and off like a light switch using drugs that target certain protein receptors in the brain. And this, I'm oversimplifying it a little bit because sometimes things go wrong with anesthesia, but the whole field of anesthesiology is heavily based on the discovery that you can actually affect a person's consciousness, and you can make the consciousness completely cease by just targeting a certain protein in the brain. There's a protein called the GABA receptor. GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid. It's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. And when I say inhibitory neurotransmitter, what I mean is if you hit the protein receptor for that neurotransmitter with a certain drug, like a general anesthetic, then that will initiate a cascade of physical events. It will open up channels in the cell membrane. It will allow uh, uh, electrically charged ions to flow across the cell membrane, and that will hyperpolarize the membrane of the neurons in the brain, and that will make them more resistant to having what's called an action potential, which is when an electrical signal propagates down the length of a neuron. And if you target that protein and you initiate that cascade of events, it can kind of sort of shut down the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, in the part of our brain up here, and that is what initiates the loss of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And this phenomenon is dose dependent, so we know that it can happen to varying degrees. It's reversible, so as the drug washes out of the patient's system, their brain gradually returns to consciousness. And you can affect consciousness in other ways too, right? Like there's psychedelic drugs. There are
Yeah.
drugs like LSD and psilocybin
Mm-hmm.
that can initiate various altered states of consciousness, but it's all doing this through, various actions in the brain. So I would say that, and I mean, there's other lines of evidence, like the
Yes.
fact that consciousness exists to varying degrees of complexity. Like there's even there's a roundworm, the species Caenorhabditis elegans. This is the adult body size of this worm is only like 1.5 millimeters in length, give or take. And the nervous system of this animal is so small that if you put it under a sufficiently high-powered microscope, you could go through in the span of a few minutes and count up all the individual neurons in the organism, in the whole body. And in spite of this nervous system being microscopically small, this animal is able to, on some level, behave differently depending on the source of sensation that it's getting. So, for example, there was a paper studied a few years ago by a lab at Stanford University that found that there's an individual neuron that will behave differently depending on whether the source of input is self-sensing. So if it senses its own self, like if the worm is kind of wrapped up in a little circle and it comes into contact with its own tail, for example, versus some external environmental source of sensation. And so there's, and I would argue, and I mean, we could maybe have some kind of a philosophical discussion about what's the best definition of consciousness, but I would argue that the ability to make some meaningful distinction between self and non-self, or between self and environment,
I like that.
Is kind of the at the root of what we mean by when we say consciousness, or at least at the root of what we mean when we say self-awareness. And then you could scale it up from the worm to slightly more complex species. There's a paper by the animal psychologist B.F. Skinner, excuse me, and he showed that pigeons are able to recognize their own reflection in the mirror. They're able to recognize themselves in the mirror. And so there's this paper published in the journal Science. I think the title was Self-Awareness in the Pigeon. And then you can scale it up to more complex creatures, chimpanzees and great apes and humans. And so across the animal kingdom, there's different levels of consciousness that we can at least observe from an outsider perspective, in terms of observing behaviors that look like conscious behaviors, or they look like the behaviors that are consistent with a conscious experience. And these levels of consciousness tend to scale with different levels of complexity of the nervous system.
It is.
And then when
go
ahead.
No, please. I don't want to interrupt you again. Please finish your line of thinking.
Okay, yes, for sure. So those are just the two main lines of evidence that I see, that consciousness is something that seems to exist on a continuum, and the different levels of consciousness kind of scale, or they correlate to the different degrees of complexity in the nervous system. And then the other line of evidence is that consciousness itself is something that can be manipulated by manipulating the brain. And so there's a cause and effect relationship between brain activity and consciousness. And then there's also between the complexity of the brain and the degree of or the sophistication or complexity of behaviors that we can find that we can associate with consciousness related behaviors, like the ability to recognize oneself versus other things besides oneself, for example. To me, it looks like the evidence is pointing in the direction of consciousness, at least as far as we understand it, is dependent on the function of physical hardware like a brain. And then, of course, we can look at the tree of life and see that, well, there are some branches that have brains, and there are some branches of the tree of life that don't have brains, like, there's plants and fungus and bacteria, for example. And so we can conclude, based on looking at the evolutionary history of life, that brains are themselves the product of evolution. And then we can look at these experiments with neuroscience and see that, well, consciousness appears to depend on the brain. And so to me, the evidence looks like it's pointing in the direction of when we think of a mind, or we think of consciousness, we're seeing something that itself is contingent on deeper underlying laws of nature. And I think that kind of flips the reasoning on its head, because the whole thing I was responding to is where you said that when we see a mechanism, it's contingent on a mind, but everything we can look at and point at and study and say, well, here's a mind, here's consciousness. It looks like itself is something that's contingent on physical mechanisms.
So the fact, for example, I love this. So for me, and unfortunately, we went over I usually do 1 hour interviews, and I want to do that, but it's just so sometimes I'm not able to do it because everything is so interesting. I see that, Brian. I actually see that, but the thing is that when explaining that consciousness could be a property that emerges from matter over huge periods of time, it's
Mhm.
just telling me again that in order to, for example, to have a consciousness, which is incredible. I mean, the fact that matter is able to transcend itself in order to create a new realm of understanding that is not physical, which we know that is it also. We know that, if we actually get this hypothesis, which I could agree with you, the evidence is pointed to that point, because I don't see the matter as a bad thing. When explaining all of this, I see again, okay, so in order to, if this is actually the reasoning, that consciousness is a property that was emerging from matter. In order to have those things, you have to have those things. You have to have matter, and
Mhm.
you have to have matter that leads to consciousness. And that, for me, posits, like, it's puzzling because it tells me I actually don't know anything about anything. We get to describe things beautifully, but in order to describe those things, we need a given, which is a universe, we need a given that is a universe that is intelligible, and we need a brain that can understand that universe that is a given.
Mhm.
And we have all these patterns that can be reconciled by a mind that can understand them. And I really don't have a problem thinking that consciousness could be a property emerging from matter. That is just, it posits more interesting questions about why this could be like this, but it doesn't truly explain the reason why things are the way they are. And I'm aware, of course, that that is not, perhaps in the future, the realm of science just expands to explain those kind of questions. Who knows? But at this moment, science's goals is not, I think, is not doing that. But I think all of this is very interesting, Brian, and I really appreciate how incredibly open-minded you are. And I love having conversations with you, because when
Mhm.
you talk, actually, you bring data, you bring names, and you bring, um, uh, arguments from. I think that's not fair to say that way. Arguments from authority. Like, you bring data, you bring people that have written about this topic, so it's not just only your opinion, and I really appreciate that. I really hope that in the future, when I keep reading about this, I could do the same in terms of, for example, in terms of philosophy, because I think I don't want to pursue a, a career as a scientist. But I appreciate you a lot, Brian. Talking to you is always a pleasure. I really like it. And for all of you that are watching this episode, just know that I will be interested to hear your thoughts about what Brian says. Please write in the comments anything that you want to ask me, or you want to ask Brian. And also, of course, if you guys want to be in contact with Brian, you can go through me and email me at askandwondernashville at gmail.com, and I will be happy to connect you with Brian, because he's an incredible guy, always open to have these conversations. And well, Brian, I'm very happy to have this conversation with you. You have any thoughts before finishing your conversation?
Yeah, if I could just take a moment to kind of unpack a little bit more. I'll be brief, but
Yes.
kind of what I've been thinking about in terms of getting back to what I said at the beginning about wanting to connect my understanding of like the underlying
Yes.
laws of physical science, because my undergrad degree was in chemistry and biochemistry
Mhm.
mostly, and now I'm more thinking about emergent property. Well, you mentioned about consciousness being emergent. I'm thinking
Mhm.
more about emergent properties. Um, and so one of the things I want to maybe at least tell your viewers and listeners about, and maybe share some literature on if I get the chance,
Yes.
is there's this phenomenon called the evolutionary transitions in individuality.
Mhm.
And the main point is that the um, there's a transition in which individual units within a population that replicate individually collectively form a larger unit that replicates as a single whole, or as an individual collective unit. And so, for example, the application of this to the origin of life would have looked something like individual molecules that replicate themselves uh, through the process of natural selection form a larger collective unit. And that's what we think of as a genome, consisting of multiple genes that now they replicate as a unit instead of individually. And
Mm.
then different genomes and different chromosomes form the eukaryotic cell that replicates as a single unit, and then multiple multicellular organisms evolved and by the process of individual cells getting together and replicating as a unit. Well, sorry, not getting together, but basically, one cell can divide and that results in two cells, but they're stuck together, so they cooperate rather than fighting, for example.
Mhm.
And then when you get to higher order organisms like insects, ants, and bees live in these cooperative communities, and humans live in cooperative communities. And so that's one of the things that I think has some beauty about the universe that we live in. And this, I think, is true whether you're a Christian or an atheist, is that there's this hierarchy from genes to cells to multicellular organisms to social groups. There's this hierarchy all up and down that whole set that I just explained, where at each individual level within this hierarchy, you see individual members of a larger whole that cooperate and get together as a group in order to give rise to that higher order structure. So
Mm.
like when you're in grade school learning about science, you learn that, there's this collection of genes within a cell, there's a collection of cells within a multicellular organism, there's a collection of multicellular organisms within an ecosystem. But that doesn't just represent some arbitrary way that life is organized. It also represents the history of things cooperating as a group in order to give rise to the next thing, basically. And so that's kind of where my focus is in terms of my research, and what I'm thinking about is kind of studying these dynamic behaviors of cooperation and selfishness, and what are the conditions that can give a selfish entity an advantage over a cooperative entity, and then what are the conditions that can flip that and go the other way around.
Mm.
And so I just want people to kind of think about that, maybe because it might help people see with a little bit more clarity the living world and how we can connect chemistry and microbiology to the space of social animals and cultures.
It is truly remarkable that there is a world there that can be that can be understood at different levels, and the fact that we can understand it is also incredible. So thank you for sharing all of this, and we'll share, Bryan and I, some links with you so that you can, if you guys are interested in reading more about some of the things that you guys heard from Bryan especially, and perhaps for me, we'll share it with you in the description. Bryan, I really hope that you have a good day, and thank you very much for spending time with us, okay?
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It was really fun.
Bye.